I've investigated many stories about cursed families, about houses that should no longer be standing, and about pacts sealed by the silence of generations. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I encountered when I crossed the rusted gates of the Whitmore estate in the far north of Vermont. The vegetation seemed resistant to time, but not to forgetfulness. Roots burst through cracks in the pavement as if trying to bury everything. And in the center of the property, motionless like a tombstone, the mansion rose. It was as if the structure hadn't been built, but unearthed. If this story already makes you uneasy, you might want to subscribe to the channel. Trust me, what comes next is even more disturbing. What brought me there was a will, a brown envelope sealed with black wax that arrived in the mail with no return address. Inside, a handwritten letter in century-old script. The Whitmore inheritance belongs to he who dares to listen. The date at the bottom read November 2nd, 1953, signed only with an initial, T. For weeks I tried to ignore it. I carried on with my work as an archivist and independent researcher in New York, reviewing 19th century doctors' journals and reports from abandoned asylums. But whenever I turned off the lights, I felt something strange. Not fear, more like a soundless whisper, a constant call from the most forgotten corner of the map. I was seized by a silent obsession. I began searching for everything I could about the Whitmores, civil records, old newspapers, aerial photographs of the estate. But it was as if they had vanished from history. No Whitmores on voting lists since 1960, no articles since 1957, no recorded deaths, nothing. Then I found, in a scanned microfilm session at the Brattleboro Public Library, a footnote in a May 13, 1928 obituary column. It simply said, "Thomas Whitmore will be buried in a private ceremony. The family requests that no photographs be taken." It was the only public mention in nearly a century of that name, Thomas. The name would return, repeatedly. The road leading there was a tunnel of overgrown trees, old pines that seemed to bow over the path. Along the way, I counted at least 4 abandoned houses. One still had a rusted bicycle in the yard. No one had lived in that region for decades. The few maps of the town of Kingsmouth, yes, that was its name, had been discontinued since 1984. When I arrived, I noticed the gate was open, as if waiting for me. There were fresh tire tracks in the mud. Someone had been there, or never left. The Whitmore mansion is hard to describe without sounding like exaggeration. Its style was a blend of late Victorian and European Gothic, but with details that belonged to no known architectural school. Stained glass windows that reflected the interior instead of the exterior, a central tower with blind windows, and a main door bearing the inscription, Roman numeral 18, Roman numeral 13, carved in archaic Latin. I would later discover that Roman numeral 13 was part of a ritualistic cycle. The air there felt thicker, as if time moved slower, or refused to move at all. On the porch, a rocking chair was still swaying, but there was no wind. That's when I understood. The house wasn't just an abandoned structure. It was waiting, watching, memorizing. When I pushed open the front door, a sweet and ancient odor hit me, the kind of smell you recognize without ever having smelled before. A mixture of melted wax, wet wood, and something decaying. The portraits on the walls had their faces erased, scratched out with black paint or with eyes replaced by symbols. On all of them, the same signature, the Guardian. I would later discover that every generation of the Whitmores spoke to their dead, but not in dreams, not out of longing. They kept them alive, bound somehow to that house, and it always began the same way, with the silent calling and the name Thomas. Now that I've entered, I'm not sure I can leave. I can only tell the story. And you, listening to me, perhaps you're being called too. The Whitmore mansion was not just a structure. It was a wound that never closed. From the outside, it loomed like a necropolis cloaked in ivy, with windows that reflected no sunlight, even at midday. The front steps sagged, creaked beneath my weight, and exhaled the scent of mildew and old iron. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, and only when I noticed the faint outline of a handprint on the brass, slightly too large to be mine, did I push the door open. The interior swallowed me in shadows. The house's silence was total, yet never empty. Floorboards sighed without footsteps. A grandfather clock ticked somewhere deep in the west wing, though its chimes had long ceased. In the main foyer, above a spiral staircase choked with dust, hung an enormous oil painting of the estate itself. Oddly, it depicted the house in winter, snow coating the trees, icicles from the eaves, but the frame bore a date, August 22nd, 1926. The artist's name had been scratched away. On a pedestal just beneath the painting rested a sealed envelope addressed to the last Whitmore. My pulse quickened. Inside, another handwritten letter waited, this time inked in a darker, almost rust-colored script. If you are reading this, it means the line has bent, not broken. You carry the name even if you do not know it. The house has called you home. Obey its rhythm. Listen after dusk. Speak only in the blue room. Do not turn your back to the portraits. T. Whitmore, May 2nd, 1953. The name again, Thomas. There was no record of a Thomas Whitmore living past 1928, yet the signature in this letter was dated 25 years later, and it was the same hand. I compared it to the original envelope that led me here. Identical curves, same pressure. The ink might as well have been fresh. The first day was disorienting. I explored room after room, parlors filled with cracked phonographs, libraries where entire shelves had been turned backward to hide the titles, and bedrooms still made as if awaiting guests long gone. The attic door was nailed shut with heavy iron clasps, and the cellar was padlocked from the outside. I found no electricity, but the old oil lamps flickered with surprising readiness. In what must have once been a nursery, I discovered the first real clue. The wallpaper was peeling in floral patterns, but on the exposed plaster underneath, someone had written rows of names in pencil, dozens of them, each followed by a single word: heard, whispered, screamed. Every fifth name had a symbol beside it, a downward triangle with a dot in the center. The last name on the list was Thomas Whitmore, answered. I took photographs, but later the symbols failed to appear in the images. That night I stayed in what seemed to be the master bedroom. There was no mattress, only a brass bed frame covered in sheets of parchment. The parchment held diagrams, ritual circles, calendars marked with moons, instructions written in Latin and something else. Some words seemed Slavic, others almost phonetic transcriptions of guttural chants. I recognized one repeated phrase beneath many of the diagrams. Roman numeral 13 completes the binding. Sleep did not come easily. At exactly 2:15 in the morning, the pipes began to moan, not clanging or groaning, moaning, as if the house was exhaling through its bones. The sound came from every wall at once, and then shifted downward, toward the basement. I followed the sound barefoot, feeling each step sink into chilled floorboards. But when I reached the cellar door, the noise ceased entirely. The lock remained in place. Ice crusted the hinges. The second day revealed more of the Whitmore family's strangeness. I found an old armoire full of clothes dating back to the late 19th century, all in impeccable condition. The tags on many items bore a stitched name, Eloise Whitmore. Beneath them, hidden in a velvet-lined drawer, lay a collection of black and white photographs. Each photograph showed members of the family in what appeared to be seance rituals. Drapes closed, candles arranged in patterns on the floor, and chairs set around a central object. But that object was always obscured, either overexposed in the image or deliberately blurred, as if scratched or smudged by hand. In one picture, dated October 4th, 1916, a child sat blindfolded in the center of the circle, surrounded by 4 adults holding hands. The caption on the back read, "He spoke through her." The child's name, written in faded ink, Rose Whitmore, age 7. Rose's name appeared again later in a crumbling diary I found beneath a false bottom in a drawer in the upstairs study. The journal began in neat looping handwriting, presumably Eloise's. But as the pages progressed, the writing grew erratic, rushed, fragmented. Pages were torn out in bunches, some partially burned. On the last intact page, dated December 12, 1916, she wrote, "The house requires 7 voices. It will not wait for the unwilling. Rose has become the 7th. Forgive me, but the lineage must hold. Roman numeral 13 has begun its return." I read and reread that entry until my hands trembled. 7 voices, a ritual, the same numbers, the same symbols. That evening, I entered the so-called blue room mentioned in the first letter. The walls were painted a faded navy, the furniture covered in white cloths like forgotten ghosts. But on the north wall hung a massive mirror, floor to ceiling, with a frame made of animal bone. I stood in front of it and whispered the name, Thomas. The light in the mirror dimmed. For just a second I swear I saw a second reflection beside mine, taller, older, watching. It vanished when I turned my head. In the days that followed, I began mapping the house. Its layout shifted slightly each night. Doors that had once led to closets now revealed staircases. A hallway that had ended in a pantry now opened onto a narrow vestibule lined with paintings of people with no eyes. I kept notes, sketches, times. I measured walls with twine. The results were inconsistent, impossible. I was not alone in the house. Some nights I heard breathing in the vents. Once, a child's laughter echoed through the pipes, even though every door and window was locked. I tried to leave on the fourth morning, tried to walk back to my car, but the road had vanished. The trees pressed too close. The path had become a spiral. I returned to the house out of exhaustion, and always, every night without fail, at exactly 2:15, the house moaned, and the portraits watched. It was on the sixth day that I discovered the hidden room behind the library. The Whitmore Library was massive, 2 stories, with rolling ladders and stained glass skylights that filtered gray light through cracked panes. Most books were theological in nature, obscure monastic treatises, translated grimoires, and volumes on necromancy that had clearly never passed through official printers. I noted one recurring title, De Oribus Mortuorum, bound in blood-colored leather, translated loosely as On the Ears of the Dead, but it was not a book that revealed the passage. It was a sound. Late in the evening, I heard a knock, 3 sharp taps, from behind the western shelf. I followed the sound to a section labeled Genealogy and Local Records. Pulling away the books, I uncovered a false wall panel with hinges masked by dust. Behind it, a narrow spiral staircase, descending in silence. I brought a lantern and descended. The chamber below was windowless and stone-lined, colder than the rest of the house. On the far wall was an altar carved directly from bedrock, upon which lay several preserved documents wrapped in cloth. Behind the altar, an entire gallery of portraits stretched across the wall, nearly 24 faces, all meticulously painted, all defaced. Each had its eyes either gouged out with a blade or covered in thick black paint. But beneath the damage, the resemblances between them were unmistakable. Each of them bore the same crooked half-smile, the same widow's peak, the same icy blue eyes, at least where the paint hadn't obscured them. Each portrait bore the same signature, Thus Whitmore, Guardian. One in particular stood out, a painting of a woman holding a stillborn child, dated January 3, 1913. Both mother and infant had their mouths sewn shut in the painting. In her lap rested a letter sealed with wax. In the bottom corner of the canvas, a Roman numeral 13. I turned my attention to the documents on the altar. Inside the first bundle was a collection of handwritten ledgers spanning more than 150 years, each bound in string. They were family records, names, births, marriages, but every fifth generation had red ink, underlined dates, and cryptic remarks such as harvested, retained, or transferred. Some entries listed multiple dates of death, others ended with only a symbol, the downward triangle with a central dot. In a ledger from 1864, one name was circled in thick ink, Thomas Whitmore, retained beyond measure. I spent the entire night copying entries, charting the generations. The name Thomas appeared in every cycle, one in each generation, always followed by that same word, retained, always male, always heir. The earliest entry was dated October 12, 1791. Thomas Whitmore, born in blood and moonlight, chosen of the 13th. The vow begins. That was the first written mention of the so-called vow. From that point forward, every generation carried some echo of it. Rituals performed at specific lunar intervals, spoken rites in the Blue Room, references to a pact known only as the Bind. The more I read, the more I realized. This was not simply a haunted house. It was a designed mechanism, ritualistic, cyclical, generational. Every fifth generation was required to retain one Whitmore. The rest were released, some through death, others through erasure. In one tattered journal belonging to Eloise Whitmore, dated May 14, 1915, I found a line that haunts me still. They must speak to their dead every night, or the house will take them whole. Later pages described nightly ceremonies in the Blue Room, with each family member sitting silently while the retained one recited a phrase in an unknown tongue. Silence was forbidden. Even infants were expected to listen. On the bottom of one page was a note written hastily. If the voices answer, do not look at them. Never look. That is how they find the next. I began noticing changes in the house as I read further. Doors no longer stayed shut. Whispers began seeping from the vents during the daytime. The rocking chair on the porch started creaking rhythmically at dawn. Once, I caught my reflection in the library window blinking out of sync with me. One morning I discovered that a new portrait had been hung in the upstairs hall. My portrait, crude, unfinished, but my eyes were unmistakable, and the signature read, The Whitmore, Guardian. I had not painted it. I tore it down and locked it in the drawing room. The next morning, it was back on the wall, more finished this time, my mouth slightly open, as if beginning to speak. I no longer knew how long I had been in the house. time began to lose meaning. My watches all stopped at 2:15. The light outside never changed. No mail arrived. No power returned. Even my phone, though fully charged, had no signal and no memory of my call logs. The most damning document I found was a confession, unsigned, dated March 3, 1933, written in a trembling hand. The ritual began with voices, then blood. We buried the first Thomas beneath the blue room. He was only 9, but the house demanded lineage. Each Whitmore must return to the 13th cycle. It is the only way to keep them speaking, to keep them with us. That was when I began digging. Beneath the floorboards of the blue room, I uncovered a trapdoor covered in layers of old rugs and furniture. The hinges screamed when I opened it, revealing a narrow descent into what looked like a hand-dug cavity. Inside, I found bone, children's bones, arranged in a circle. At the center, a small open book. Its title unreadable, its contents smudged with dried black ink. In the margins of one page, someone had scrawled, "Roman numeral 13 binds us. The 13th Thomas will unbind." The house had been preparing, for centuries, preparing for a return or a release. And I had spoken the name aloud. I had entered the blue room. I had opened the door. And now, each night when I sit in silence at 2:15, the house moans, and I hear the others. They whisper in languages I do not understand. They laugh without breath. They tell me secrets I should not know, and one of them calls me Thomas. The deeper I fell into the Whitmore legacy, the more I realized I had to leave the house. Not to escape, but to investigate. There were names, dates, and symbols that pointed beyond the estate. The documents weren't just accounts of rituals. They referenced others, outsiders, who had participated, concealed, or conveniently forgotten. If I wanted to understand the scale of what the Whitmores had done, I had to see who else had helped them. I drove east toward the nearest surviving town, Ashbrook, a decaying hamlet with only a few hundred residents, half of whom seemed to be over the age of 70. It took nearly 2 hours to find the municipal archives. They were located in the basement of the town hall, down a hall with flickering fluorescent lights and the scent of rotting paper. The receptionist, a gaunt woman named Mary Ann, looked at me strangely when I asked for records on the Whitmore family. "Why would you want those?" she asked. "They're not local. They owned land near Kingsmouth," I said. "I'm doing some genealogical work." She hesitated, then led me to a microfilm reader. "If anything survived, it'll be on these. But people don't dig into the Whitmores anymore. Not since the fire. Fire. That was the first I had heard of one." I combed through reels for hours. Scattered across various decades were brief mentions. Land purchases in 1867, a lawsuit dismissed in 1922, and most curiously, a police report dated October 17, 1934, regarding a missing child named Emily Rausch. The girl had last been seen approaching the Whitmore property during an unsanctioned Halloween dare. Her body was never found. The case was closed in 1936 due to lack of probable leads. In the margin of the case summary was a handwritten note. Thomas refused to speak, said she was still speaking back. I found the name of the detective assigned to the case, George Mallory. A quick online search from the library's public terminal revealed that his grandson, Vincent Mallory, still lived nearby. I drove to the listed address, a sagging 2-story home on the outskirts of town, overgrown with weeds and shaded by black maples. Vincent was in his late 80s, his face lined with the kind of knowledge people beg their memories to forget. He stared at me for a long time before speaking. "You've been to the house, haven't you?" I nodded. "I inherited it. At least, that's what the letter said." Vincent didn't laugh. "That's how it always starts. You get a letter, no return address, a key, a name that sounds just close enough to family. What do you know about them?" He exhaled slowly. "More than I ever wanted. My grandfather tried to stop them. He thought they were abducting children for some cult. Ritualistic re-education, he called it. But no one in town would talk. The Whitmores built this area, paid for the schoolhouse, the cemetery, the hospital wing. You couldn't get a councilman elected here without their name on the check. They owned the town. Worse, Vincent said. They were the town." He handed me a faded photograph. It showed a group of 30 or so men and women posed in front of the old town courthouse. The caption on the back read, "Council of Elders, Kingsmouth, 1905. At the center was a tall man with piercing blue eyes and a child held tightly in his grip. "That's Thomas Whitmore VII, Vincent said. "They said he never aged. From 1879 to 1914, he looked exactly the same in every photograph. Some thought he was the same Thomas from the 1820s, just hiding behind his own descendants. But no one dared to question him. Why not? Because the people who did vanished, or worse, their families were blacklisted. Children taken from schools, businesses shut down. There's a mass grave on the edge of Ashbrook marked as cholera victims, but my grandfather said it was filled with whistleblowers. I asked if anyone else had tried to expose the family. One journalist, he said, Eleanor Brandt, wrote a series in the Vermont Ledger about secret societies in Kingsmouth. Her last article, March 5, 1961, claimed she had tapes of Whitmore rituals. She was found dead the following week in her apartment, apparent overdose, but the autopsy showed no drugs. Her mouth was packed with soil. He showed me a photocopy of that final article. It had been heavily redacted, but one sentence remained untouched. They speak to their dead, but it's not the dead who answer. Vincent leaned in close. You think this is about ghosts or seances? It's about contracts. Every generation renewed the agreement. Speak, bind, sacrifice, repeat. The 13th cycle they talk about. It's not symbolic. It's a clock, and it's striking midnight soon. He warned me to leave, burn the house, salt the grounds, but I couldn't. Not yet. Something inside me needed to finish it. Before I left Ashbrook, I stopped at the public cemetery. Near the back, in a shaded quadrant overgrown with moss, I found the Whitmore section. The tombstones were small and unmarked, save for Roman numerals carved at the base. 13 of them, all arranged in a circle. Each bore a name, Thomas. I returned to the mansion under a slate-gray sky. Rain had started to fall, light at first, then with the intensity of something purposeful. The land around the house drank it like blood. As I stepped through the front door, I noticed the change immediately. The house had shifted again. The blue room was no longer upstairs. I found it on the ground floor now, where the drawing room used to be. Its walls were darker, its windows gone. The mirror was larger, floor to ceiling, edge to edge, and the frame that once seemed like bone now pulsed faintly, like veins beneath translucent skin. The portrait of me had been moved into this room. It was fully finished now. My expression, empty-eyed, lips parted mid-word. The caption beneath read, "The Whitmore Threed, the Unbinder." I should have left then, but something compelled me to stay. Not fear, not duty. Something older, something like inheritance. That night, at exactly 2:15, I stood before the mirror and whispered the name again. Thomas. The mirror darkened. This time it didn't stop. The glass melted into shadow, and in its place appeared a tunnel, not metaphorical, not a trick of light. A real passage, carved in black stone, descending deep beneath the house. I stepped forward. The air turned thick with the scent of iron and dust. What I found beneath the Whitmore estate was not a cellar. It was a catacomb, a complex of ritual chambers, ossuaries, and altars carved over generations. Symbols glowed faintly on the walls, Roman numerals, alchemical sigils, phrases in dead languages. The first chamber held 13 masks on stone busts. Each mask was human skin, stretched and dried, with mouths sewn shut and eye sockets burned black. Below each bust, a nameplate, Thomas Vi, Thomas II, and so on. When I reached the center of the complex, I found the main ritual hall. It was circular, lined with stone thrones. On the floor, etched into basalt, was an enormous sigil composed of 3 interlocking triangles, surrounding the number 13, Roman numeral 13. In each throne sat a rotting corpse in ceremonial robes, heads tilted upward, mouths frozen in silent chant. The center of the chamber contained a pit, perfectly round, black as ink, filled with liquid that did not reflect light. Above it hovered a frame, empty, matching the mirror upstairs. A journal lay on a lectern beside the pit. It was bound in human hide, stamped with the downward triangle. Its pages described the ritual. Each cycle, a Thomas is chosen. His voice sustains the bond. If the voice fails, the silence spreads. The 13th shall be the unbinder, or the eternal vessel. The duality chilled me. Either I was the one who would break the cycle, or the final sacrifice to preserve it forever. I turned the page. It outlined the ritual process in gruesome detail. The calling, the preparation of the flesh, the awakening of the listened, and finally, the binding, wherein the soul of the 13th Thomas would either sever the pact or descend into the pit, becoming the voice eternal. It required a witness, and someone had already taken that role. I turned and found her, an old woman in ceremonial robes, pale as ash, her eyes completely white. She did not speak, but instead opened her mouth wide enough that her jaw cracked audibly. From her throat, a voice, not hers, spoke. "My son returns." It was my voice. She approached and handed me a blade, obsidian, curved, ancient. She gestured to the pit. The voices of the other Thomases echoed from the walls now, layered and distant, some pleading, others chanting in broken tongues. My mind swam. Then the visions came. I saw the origin, 1789, the first Whitmore, sealing a pact with a being not of this world, a guardian of the threshold, a being that offered prosperity, longevity, vision, but demanded a voice to tether itself to our plane, a speaker, a vessel, a child. Each Thomas was that voice, each generation, the pact renewed. I saw their faces, their fates, drowned, burned, buried alive, dissected, bound in paintings, sealed beneath mirrors. I saw Rose Whitmore whispering to a mirror that bled. I saw Eloise with her hands covered in ash, cradling a boy with no eyes. And I saw myself, not in the past, in the chamber, speaking, chanting, becoming. The ritual had begun. The pit pulsed. The thrones rattled. The corpses swayed. I stepped forward and raised the blade, and in that moment, I remembered something from Eloise's journal. If the 13th speaks his own name while holding the blade, the bond is broken. But if another speaks it first, the silence continues. I opened my mouth. The old woman screamed a name. Thomas! Too late. The pit opened. The mirror in the blue room shattered, and I fell. When I awoke, I was no longer in the pit. I found myself sprawled on the mansion's front lawn, drenched in mud and blood, with the house behind me burning from the inside out. Smoke poured through shattered windows. Flames licked at the porch beams. The mirror in the blue room had exploded outward, embedding shards into the earth like teeth, yet I bore no wound. Only the blade remained, charred, cracked, but intact, resting in my hand. Sirens approached from the east, winding through the thick forest road. I had called them during a brief moment of lucidity inside the chamber, right before the descent. A pre-scheduled email to a friend in Boston, coordinates, a confession, and dozens of scanned documents. I didn't expect to survive. I didn't expect to return, but something had intervened, or perhaps something had been satisfied. When the police arrived, I didn't resist. I handed over the blade. I led them into what was left of the house. What remained was enough. Investigators found skeletal remains beneath the blue room, 13 child-sized bodies in a perfect circle. They found the masks. The pit, though collapsed, had left a crater lined with carvings. The portraits, now fully visible, showed unmistakable faces, including one that matched a missing person from the 1970s. The DNA matched. The authorities reacted with cautious disbelief. Federal agents took over the site within 48 hours. Anthropologists, historians, and forensic pathologists were called in. The house was declared a historic crime scene and fenced off. News coverage was brief, just a few articles referencing a ritualistic compound uncovered in rural Vermont. But none went into detail. None mentioned the Whitmores by name. I was questioned for hours, then days. I told them everything. About the legacy, the rituals, the blue room, the 13th cycle. At first they chalked it up to trauma, but then I showed them the documents, the ledger entries, the diaries, the paintings, and the journal bound in skin. It took 2 weeks for a special task force to conclude its preliminary report. A leak surfaced, a PDF file containing 300 pages of evidence, quickly wiped from the web, but not before it spread. Among the contents, photographs of the ritual chamber beneath the estate, a timeline of the 13 Thomas Whitmores, with partial census records to support their existence. Forensic results identifying at least 4 of the skeletal remains as children reported missing between 1928 and 1964. Audio recovered from the house's ventilation system, low-frequency whispers that analysts could not trace to any speaker. A letter, dated April 2, 1957, in which a Vermont senator acknowledges receipt of a Whitmore offering and thanks the family for their continued support of longevity research. That phrase, support of longevity research, would appear in multiple other documents. It became clear that the conspiracy extended far beyond the house. The Whitmores had bribed, blackmailed, and bought silence for generations, but it was over. At least, that's what they believed. The official narrative concluded that the Whitmore family had been a multi-generational cult, using folklore and trauma-based indoctrination to maintain power. The estate was ordered demolished. Ritual artifacts were sent to secure facilities for study. I was exonerated and released under psychological observation. They wanted to call it madness, but they couldn't explain the footage, because inside the ritual chamber, mounted on a rusted bracket above the pit, investigators found a camera. Footage had survived. 92 minutes of ritual documentation, spanning at least 5 generations. The film showed the ceremony from the early 1900s, grainy black and white, children chanting while blindfolded. Later, A color reel from the 1970s showed a man identified as Thomas Whitmore XI slicing his palm and drawing a triangle in blood. In the final segment, someone filmed the 13th chamber from above, just hours before my arrival. I was in the frame, staring directly into the lens, but I had never seen a camera. When asked to explain it, I couldn't, and when they slowed the footage, frame by frame, they found something else. Faces in the stone, moving, watching, whispering. The final recommendation from the task force was to level the entire property and salt the ground. And so, on March 13th, the date burned into so many documents, the demolition took place. The house did not go quietly. Multiple workers were injured by equipment failure. Excavators lost control. One of the engineers reported hearing voices, calling him home from beneath the earth. But eventually, the estate was reduced to rubble. Concrete was poured. A memorial was built, a single granite pillar, inscribed only with 13 names, first names, all Thomas. The officials called it closure, but the Whitmores never believed in endings, only silence. And silence, as I've learned, is not absence. It is waiting. In the months following the destruction of the Whitmore estate, something unexpected began to unfold, slow at first, then spreading like a contagion of reckoning. The story, despite attempts to contain it, could not be silenced. The footage, the documents, the bones, they had ignited something long dormant in the collective consciousness. What had once been regarded as whispers of folklore now became catalysts for institutional review, historical revisionism, and an unraveling of secrets far beyond Kingsmouth. The first wave of change came from the academic world. Within 6 weeks of the demolition, a consortium of historians, anthropologists, and theologians petitioned to unseal the full Whitmore archive. Nearly 3,000 recovered items ranging from ledgers and ritual manuals to family correspondence and coded maps. Harvard Divinity School created a dedicated team to translate and study the materials, concluding within their first preliminary report that the Whitmores had maintained a coherent and evolving ritual theology for over 200 years, centered on sacrifice, inheritance, and symbolic vocal continuity. A controversial conclusion emerged that the family had not simply preserved a cultic belief system, but had established a working ritual praxis that seemed to produce observable effects. Scholars began publicly debating whether the rituals had achieved their stated purpose, longevity. Evidence was circumstantial but eerie, records suggesting that at least 2 individuals bearing the name Thomas Whitmore had lived well beyond what medical science could explain, with one reportedly surviving past 130 years, though no official death certificate was ever filed. Simultaneously, genealogists and digital archivists working independently across North America uncovered something deeply unsettling: traces of the Whitmore lineage in dozens of unrelated families. Names changed, identities hidden, but DNA threads, collected from medical studies and ancestry databases, revealed a shocking truth. The Whitmores had not vanished. They had dispersed. One particular file went viral, a declassified communication between the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and a defunct genetics firm, dated July 15, 1987, discussing the Whitmore vector and its use in testing generational resilience markers tied to auditory and neurological receptivity. The implications were chilling. It suggested that knowledge of the Whitmore rituals had been quietly incorporated into unethical government experimentation. A congressional inquiry was launched. Whistleblowers stepped forward. One former employee of a psychiatric research institute in Montana testified that certain patients had been chosen based on their ancestral resonance, a term lifted directly from the Whitmore texts. The revelations triggered national outcry. Multiple agencies came under fire for willful ignorance or active participation in suppressing the Whitmore legacy. FOIA requests flooded in. Lawsuits emerged from the families of missing persons whose remains were believed to be among those discovered at the estate. Most damning of all was a leaked memo from the Federal Bureau of Investigation dated September 2, 1979. The Whitmore site must remain untouched. Interference could disrupt a stabilizing auditory tether. Recommend passive surveillance only. Containment preferable to confrontation. That line, auditory tether, was repeated on protest signs during marches in Washington, D.C., Boston, and Burlington. People wanted answers, and more than that, they wanted to know how many other Whitmores existed. Online forums formed overnight. The 13th Voice, Echoes of Threen, Children of the Pit. Some peddled conspiracy theories, others became research collectives. A former librarian from Rhode Island traced the symbol of the downward triangle, back to 6 different family crests spanning 3 centuries. A high school teacher in Quebec claimed to have discovered a sealed box behind the walls of her century-old home. Inside, 13 small stones arranged in a spiral, and a piece of parchment that read, "Speak only in darkness." Most chilling were the personal testimonies. People began reporting that their children were waking at precisely 2:15 in the morning, speaking in languages they did not know. A young man in Detroit filmed his mirror warping when he whispered the name Thomas. A woman in rural Maine found a portrait in her attic that bore her face, aged decades, signed, "The Whitmore Guardian." The phenomenon spread internationally. In Romania, a collapsed chapel revealed carvings matching the Whitmore sigils. In Scotland, a series of underground chambers dated to the 16th century showed near-identical ritual circles. The implication was staggering. The Whitmore legacy may have been merely one branch of a much older global pact. Back in Vermont, Kingsmouth became a kind of dark pilgrimage site. Though the estate was gone, the land itself drew visitors. Some came to honor the victims. Others came seeking answers or communion. A fence was erected. Security patrols were added. Still, offerings appeared daily at the base of the memorial. Flowers, children's shoes, cassette tapes with recordings of whispered prayers. Once, a broken mirror. The state government, overwhelmed by pressure, commissioned an independent historical council. The result was a comprehensive report titled 13 Echoes, the Whitmore Phenomenon, and the Ethics of Ancestral Silence. Among its findings, 41 individuals across 7 states with confirmed Whitmore ancestry had died under unusual circumstances in the previous year, many involving fire or water. 6 small towns had altered or removed public records of land purchases made by T. Whitmore or Guardian Holdings. 2 former mayors were found to have received yearly consultation stipends from a Whitmore trust fund as late as 2019. The conclusion was unambiguous. The Whitmore lineage operated with the complicity, either passive or active, of multiple communities and institutions. Silence was the currency. The dead were the debt. The report urged sweeping reforms in archival transparency, mandatory reporting of anomalous ritual material, and a nationwide audit of private family cemeteries and hidden estate documents. New laws passed, slowly, then in a wave. But for many, it was too late. Because the legacy didn't end with fire, it evolved. Some descendants began organizing, not in secrecy, but in solemn pride. They claimed the Whitmores were misunderstood, that the rituals weren't evil, but a misunderstood form of spiritual stewardship. They published books, held gatherings, created sanctuaries, and always, at 2:15, they gathered to listen. It has been 1 year since the Whitmore estate was reduced to rubble. 1 year since I walked away from the pit, and not a single night has passed without the voices. They don't speak in dreams. They wait for the silence between thoughts, between the breath and the heartbeat, and then they murmur, soft as smoke, curling around my consciousness with unbearable familiarity. Some nights they beg, some nights they laugh, but most nights they simply say my name, not the one I was born with, the one the house gave me, Thomas. I no longer live in cities. I've traded crowded streets for isolated roads, choosing places where the wind drowns out whispers and the sky stretches wide enough to forget. I tell myself I'm free, but I know better. The Whitmore blood doesn't flow through my veins, not genetically. I've tested it, repeatedly, but I spoke the name. I entered the blue room. I wielded the blade. That was enough. The binding never cared about DNA. It cared about the echo. I've spent the past year documenting everything, revisiting interviews, reviewing transcripts, analyzing patterns. I've spoken with researchers, psychologists, skeptics, believers. I've heard testimonies from people who claim their family lines trace back to Kingsmouth, who swear their grandparents made them whisper into jars, who burned letters each November 13th, who were told never to speak aloud the number after 12. Some of them cry when they tell me. Some of them smile. And I've come to accept something I never wanted to believe. The ritual did not end. It changed. It adapted, like language does, like grief does, because the Whitmores never worshipped the dead. They preserved them. Every whisper, every portrait, every journal entry, every child told to listen and never speak. They were keeping the voices tethered, not out of fear but of duty, not out of guilt but of legacy. And in that, they succeeded. I have the ledgers, the recordings, the unfinished paintings, and I have the mirror. I kept one shard after the explosion, just one. It doesn't reflect me anymore. It reflects the blue room as it was. I've tested it in 10 different locations. Every time the same result. An empty chair, a flickering lamp, and sometimes a hand resting gently on the table's edge, waiting. So now, I leave you with this final truth. You do not need to inherit a house to inherit a legacy. You only need to listen, to answer, to repeat the name. And if tonight, your house creaks at 2:15, don't speak, don't look in the mirror, don't listen too closely, because silence, as we've learned, isn't absence, it's invitation. If this story reached something inside you, if it made you question what hides beneath family trees, behind portraits, or inside forgotten houses, then don't let it fade. Like, share, subscribe. There are other names still hidden, other voices waiting to be heard, and other legacies that refuse to stay buried.